Hi Douglas, thank you for joining me on the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, we've had quite a lot of nice weather here, and I live at the seaside, so nice weather and seaside are very good together.
Yeah, good, good. Yeah, it's been warm, hasn't it, lately? This way, up this way.
hmm I
It's-
don't think we've had it quite as warm as you've had it, but we've had a little bit of a pleasant breeze.
that's good enough for Scotland, isn't
Yeah.
it? Well, speaking of Scotland, what was it like growing up near Glasgow, and when did music become a big part of your life?
I guess music and films were two things that I sort of always remember being crazy about. Um, and in the very early days, my dad liked music, but he wasn't like a big record collector or he didn't have a kind of specialist music taste. But, there was like music on the radio, there was music getting played in the house a lot. We only had the telly on if we were actually sitting down to watch something. It would be turned on a minute before Radio Time said the programme started and turned off as soon as the programme ended. So a lot of the other time there was music playing. But I was always really interested in the music it was playing on the TV as well, like soundtrack music. And, probably my first musical memory is the theme music from a TV series called The Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, which got shown in 1969 in the gaps during the moon landing, and then would get shown every kind of summer holiday when the schools were off. And it had this really incredibly poignant music. And even as a really young kid, I could remember it really strongly during the many months that it wasn't on the telly. I could remember all the themes and would kind of replay them to myself in my head. And the music made me feel a bit sad in that program, but I liked the feeling. It was like a beautiful sadness, So I think I was hooked from an early age.
Is that important in your music then to get emotion across?
I think, yeah, I like things. I've always been attracted to things, you know, whether it's a book, film, music that's got a kind of combination of, well, melody for me is the key thing, but also a combination of kind of poignancy and kind of a lightness of touch, a bit of humor, a bit of hope. But yeah, definitely some sort of poignancy in there as well.
Yeah. Well, when was the moment you knew you wanted to be in a band?
The moment I knew that this is what I want to do, and I mean, I wrote little songs when I was like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, kind of around that. It's still kind of nonsense songs, but I would perform them in front of the class at school and get invited to other kids' parties because I had a little party turn that I could do singing some of my little songs. Um, Norman Blake of Teenage Fan Club, my good friend, his first memory of me was he's a year younger, was me getting sent into his primary school class. And they're going, now, boys and girls, here we've got Douglas Stewart, who's going to sing us some little songs. Uh, and obviously, he was in BMX Bandits at one point as well. But yeah, the, the music, we came from a pretty depressed town, and it became more depressed as more and more of a kind of industry shut down. And so music felt like a beautiful kind of escape. You could sort of escape into this world of uh, music, and it sort of transported you to another place. I think I
Well,
sort of managed to avoid answering the question, but not deliberately. I sort of went off script, and I couldn't quite remember what the original point was.
I know, like the moment you knew you wanted to be in a band, but
Oh, the moment I wanted to be in the band was I went into Woolworths and Belshill at some point in 1977 and bought an album called Rock and Roll with the Modern Lovers, which was Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers. And my sister had heard the record the day before. Her geography teacher, rather than giving a geography lesson that day, had played them this record. And she came home and described it to me. And just from her description, I was like, wow, that sounds amazing. And it sounded kind of different to regular kind of rock or pop records at the time. And I went and got it, and I wasn't disappointed. And one of the big things I remember really thinking to myself is, I'd like to do something that makes other people feel, hopefully, or try to make other people feel like that record is making me feel. I think I found what I want to do.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, around you mentioned like it was a bit of a depressing town and scene at the time, but how important was the Splash One Club nights that Bobby Gillespie would put on, and people like yourself would go there?
Yeah, well, that was kind of 1985 to 1986. And yeah, there was little kind of club nights that would happen in our hometown of Belshill. But um, myself and my two great friends, Norman Blake and Sean Dixon, we sort of, I guess in Bellshill, we sort of felt like other people didn't seem interested in the kind of music that we were interested in. They were much more interested in like full on rock music or full on kind of aggressive kind of punk and post punk. And we were interested in other things. And so we found this uh, club called Splash One. It just was starting up through being a fan of bands like the Pastels. And like Bobby, as you say, was one of the people. Bobby from Primal Scream was one of the people that ran that. And initially, not that many people really were there. But, you know, the people who were there had a kind of like-minded quality. They would project films on the wall of the club, and it would be things like If and A Clockwork Orange and, you know, other kind of films of the kind of late 60s and Andy Warhol kind of factory type footage and stuff like that. And people would exchange mixtapes with each other. There was a sort of thing of dancing to records that you normally wouldn't have the chance to dance to in clubs that I'd went to. Usually, when you went to a disco back then, you would go to a club and they'd maybe play the one alternative record aimed at the weirdos in the town or the village, and it was usually "The Passenger" by Iggy Pop, which is a very fine record, but like that was probably 2 out of 3 weeks you would get that, and the other week you'd get an Echo and the Bunnymen song or a Teardrop Explodes song. And as I say, all fine stuff. But when that was all you were getting, and suddenly you were in this place and they were playing things like, you know, the 13th Floor Elevators and Suicide and Nancy Sinatra and Lee Hazelwood. And, you know, guys could dance with guys and girls could dance with girls. Um, there was still a lot of kind of toxic masculinity. I mean, it's coming back. I mean, it's never totally went away, but it felt like there was a period where that sort of had died down. But at that time, it was still, if you were in a band or into music and you didn't come across as being like, you know, hey, baby, get down on the floor and I'm going to give you some good hard loving. If you didn't have that kind of white snake, kind of very macho attitude about you, people kind of could be quite, I would say, aggressive towards you. You know, there was quite a lot of times in the early days when we played concerts where people wanted to give us a kicking. They were offended because, you know, people like ourselves or people like Orange Juice or the Vaselines weren't coming across like what they saw rock guys should be, you know, kind of like, well, he's eating an apple. He's on stage and he's eating an apple that he's taken out of a Sesame Street satchel, and his songs seem to be very kind of sentimental and romantic and whimsical. We want to kill him. You know, he's wearing a flowery shirt. That can't be right. So there was actually concerts where, particularly when we played up in Aberdeen, where we would be advised that we should leave through the back door, not because we were incredibly famous and it was like, you know, passionate fans waiting for us. It was like if we left through the other door, they were frightened that we would, you know, get a doing. And you know, a few times the police came to make sure we got out okay.
Gee.
It was a different time, but there's a sense of danger that's kind of disappeared from gigs, and I miss it in some ways, but in other ways, you know, it's good that a lot of those values seem to have kind of disappeared from gigs. But as I say, it's worrying that they seem to be kind of coming back in other ways.
Yeah. So that are you sort of are you not surprised that so many bands came out of that scene then that you're all so like-minded and there wasn't a lot going on in those places at that time?
There was, and I think it was the times were really grim. There was an awful lot of like real high unemployment. People didn't have a lot of money. In Glasgow, the buildings were all still kind of black. Now they've cleaned up all these old buildings and they look really beautiful. But at that time, all these buildings were really dark and oppressive. And as I say, there was definitely, a sense of danger. If we were playing somewhere that wasn't Splash One, which was not like every single person in Splash One was necessarily going to love what you did, but there was a bit more of a kind of sympathetic and open kind of mindedness. We ended up playing Splash One twice, and Sean played there with the Soup Dragons twice. So like Sean Dixon and Jim McCulloch, I think, are the only two people I think who played Splash One 4 times, because twice with Bandits and twice with the Soup Dragons. But yeah, it was, as I say, places like that and just music in general, meeting up on a Saturday afternoon in a kind of independent record store and, showing your friends that you bumped into what you had in your record bag and finding out what they had and just sharing that kind of level of enthusiasm and passion. So, yeah, that was, I mean, for some of us, some of the people who went on to larger levels of success than probably I had, as in, selling units and making lots of money, they had a way of like actually escaping because, they could afford to get out of wherever they were and live in a nicer area. I continued living in Belshill for a long time and I wasn't really complaining about it, but my heart and my mind were elsewhere. I was living in my little world of beautiful friends and beautiful music, and a kind of living out a kind of dream and kind of being laughed at and kind of threatened for it. And I mean back then, and I think it's a kind of thing now as well. I think to be truly kind of creative and truly make anything of any kind of worth, you have to be prepared to be laughed at. I think that happens in things like, or it used to happen in things like the world of science as well. People, would say, you're not going to believe this, but the world actually, goes round the sun. It's not the other way about. And the world's a ball and stuff like that. And people would kind of go, heretic, burn them, or ridicule them and stuff like that. And I think that's the same. There was a lot of sniggering. There was people who wanted to do us physical harm, and there was just other people who were very mocking of the whole thing. But that was okay. I didn't mind that. I was prepared to be ridiculed.
Did that build your character on stage then?
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of fortunate. I had, some people might have considered that I was bullied, but I never thought of myself as being bullied because I wasn't actually particularly threatened by it. Things like school and stuff like that, people would kind of shout abuse at me and kind of point and laugh and things, or, you try to noise me up. And rather than me kind of going, oh, well, I'll keep my head, I'll keep my head down and I'll kind of fit into the background, I would think to myself, what could I do that will annoy them even more? Why? How can I stand out more? And again, one of Norman's memories of me at school before he really particularly knew me so well was going to the Smokers' Corner at Belshill Academy, which had a reputation of being the roughest school in Lanarkshire in the kind of late 70s and early 80s. And having a Sherlock Holmes, a deerstalker hat and a Sherlock Holmes pipe and kind of standing there basically to annoy people up. And what you find is usually with kind of people who are bullies and things like that, if you call their bluff and you're clearly unafraid of them, they usually, that kind of punctures them a bit.
Yeah.
And some of them may end up almost having a sort of respect for you, and other ones are just like too confused and a little bit probably scared of you in some way.
You mentioned Norman there. obviously
Yeah.
BMX Bandits are one of the most important indie and Scottish bands. And you mentioned like Norman and Sean, they went on to have careers outside the band with other bands. But when did BMX Bandits start? Like, when did you get together and start the band?
We started in 1985, so yeah, 41 years ago. First single came out in 86. And we had all been in a band before called The Pretty Flowers, which just played like local shows primarily in Belshill. We did 2 or 3 shows in Glasgow, but we didn't have like a record coming out or anything like that. We sort of hoped that someone might notice us. It was probably a little bit closer to a kind of Scottish B-52s than a kind of guitar pop kind of thing, which I guess we were at the start. And also Francis McKee of the Vaselines was part of that as well. And another friend called Hugh McLaughlin, who's went on to be in like a ton of kind of underground kind of Scottish bands and is still doing it as well. So we were that band, but Francis, I think in maybe early 85, kind of broke the news that she was wanting to start a band with her new boyfriend that was Eugene Kelly, and they became the Vaselines. And Sean had just started the Soup Dragons. Norman was taking a little bit of a break from doing music stuff. He had his own group and he had a group with Sean and stuff like that. And I think he was just like, I need to have a wee bit of a rethink. So he was slightly out of the picture in 85. And Sean was busy doing the Soup Dragons. And so I felt like I was left alone a wee bit. And then Sean, even though people were clearly getting very interested in the Soup Dragons, was like, oh, I'll help you do, your next project, Douglas. And he brought Jim McCulloch in. And, we found some other people and we started BMX Bandits. And then there came a point where the Soup Dragons were doing so well. I mean, at one point, the Soup Dragons were, in the music press and sort of nighttime Radio 1. They were probably like the most exciting band in the UK at that time. People were going so crazy for them. But as I say, I'll always be grateful, that kind of Sean gave his time to early BMX Bandits. But then there came a point where he had to move on because the Soup Dragons was just taking up, so much time. And, so then Norman kind of came back in and he became the other kind of main person for a while. And it continued to be a bit like that with BMX Bandits, that other people would come in and do a thing and then they'd maybe go off and do their own project. And sometimes they would come back. Over the years, Norman's played on most BMX Bandits records. There's some like maybe 2 BMX Bandits albums that he's not actually on somewhere. Even though he left the band officially in 1991 or something, he was still pop. And Sean's popped back more recently as well. Occasionally, he'll be on a track or we work on something together. So even though people move on, very often they will return.
Kurt Cobain as well, actually, was a big fan of BMX Bandits. He said if he could be in another band, it would have been there. Like, that must be pretty crazy to hear. But how do you think because he was a big fan of the Vaselines as well, and
Yeah.
Pastels. How do you think he discovered these bands?
Well, I know how he discovered them. It was a guy called Calvin Johnson, ran a record label called K Records. I think Kurt had a little K tattoo on his arm, which people might have thought was K for Kurt, but it was K for K Records. And Calvin was sort of like the equivalent of what Stephen Pastel was like in Glasgow. He was sort of a guy that a lot of the people who were just a little bit younger would look up to, and Calvin would turn them on to lots of music from the past, but also kind of music from other places happening in the world. Bands coming out of Japan, bands coming out of Scotland and stuff, and make up people mixtapes. And yeah, so Calvin turned Kurt on to, because they were from Olympia, Calvin and his band Beat Happening. So he turned on Kurt to the Vaselines, to the Pastels, BMX Bandits, eventually, things like Teenage Fan Club and stuff like that. And yeah, when I got told about the thing of Kurt saying it, I mean, obviously I was like, wow, that's such a lovely thing he said. But I feel I always have to ad, him saying that he didn't say BMX Bandits were his favourite band. He
Mm.
said, that's the band that he would have most liked to be in. And perhaps maybe on another day he might have even said a different band. His favourite band were without a doubt the Vaselines.
Yeah.
And I can't take away from that, and I shouldn't, and no one else can. He covered, I think, either live or on Sessions Records, the MTV acoustic thing. He ended up covering some like 4 Vaseline songs, by
Yeah.
Francis and Eugene. And I mean, he loved them so much. But of course, I was delighted, and I got to meet. I didn't get to know Kurt the way that Norman got to know him or Eugene got to know him, but I got to meet Kurt like maybe three times, and one of those times, we had a bit of a conversation about music, and it seemed to me that that was his thing. He was a pretty quiet, unassuming guy, but very, very passionate about wanting to find out what other people were listening to and what music people like. We had a conversation about a band called Swell Maps, which I don't think at that point he really knew that much about. But I think people like Thurston Moore had become my fan and things. So we were talking about them, and we were also talking about a kind of eccentric American poet and musician called Rod McEwen, who I'm a real big fan of. And Kurt was sort of talking about sort of loving his thing as well. He wrote the English lyrics for Seasons in the Sun,
Oh yeah.
Rod McEwen. But he also wrote a song called Jean, which is a theme from a prime of Miss Jean Brodie. He wrote a song called The Beat Generation, which was the inspiration for Richard Hell's song, The Blank Generation. He's kind of really kind of interesting guy, and he was the sort of guy, he was a real maverick. He made a gay disco album in 1977 at a time where kind of mainstream stars were not generally coming out. So he did a lot of different things, and he was a kind of maverick, but he was a maverick. It would come into people's living rooms and Saturday night TV, and be sort of cozy and comfortable, but also be very much his own thing. And, Kurt talked about he was thinking of trying to contact Rod McEwen to see if he would be interested in doing something. And of course, all this happened way before the internet and stuff like that. So you'd no real record of this conversation other than, reporting it back yourself. And years later, this is a wee bit of a side note, but I was watching an interview about Rod McEwen. It featured a lot of footage of him a few years before he died. And he was saying, I once got a phone call from Kurt Cobain saying that he fancied maybe us doing some work together. And that was at one of those moments where I was like, I wasn't mad. He did say he wanted to do some with Ron McEwen. And when he was saying it to me, I was going, man, you've got to do it. You've got to. But people wouldn't see that coming. And I think he was at a stage where he was maybe wanting to start working with some different people and things like that. I know he asked Eugene to join Nirvana at one point and kind of be a writer in the band, and it never happened for whatever reason. But it was a terribly sad ending, and I think him saying BMX Bandits, Eugene was in BMX Bandits for a while, Norman was in BMX Bandits for a while, and they both enjoyed being in BMX Bandits because they weren't the focus of attention. I was the focus of attention. And I think, I don't know this, but I think Kurt maybe thought, I'd like to be in BMX Bandits because the focus wouldn't be on him. It would be on someone else. And he could just be having fun, making music with his pals. Probably what it was like when, he kind of started out doing stuff, rather than being, he takes a step outside and it's,
Yeah.
I don't think he was made for that kind of level of attention.
Yeah, I think it was hard for him, wasn't it? That's like that much fame. But what were you a fan of grunge music then, Nirvana and stuff?
I mean, it's a funny thing. I was never somebody got swept up in a kind of movement. There were always people in most musical movements, but I would go, am I a fan of the whole disco scene? No, but I really love the Bee Gees, and I really love Donna Summer, and I really love this. but there's all this other stuff that isn't nearly as interesting. And I guess when, grunge came along as a thing, there was like people who really, they stood out, but there was always going to be a bunch of people who've jumped on the bandwagon who aren't as interested. But, so I think that's always been the thing for me, it's like, again, when everybody jumped on the kind of, I guess, kind of ecstasy club kind of scene and all that, I would hear things that I really liked, but I didn't like just jump on and go, that's now what I'm embracing, and everything else can get shoved to the side. I think sometimes, grunge came along and it was like suddenly all these people were like, no, I never liked any of the other things. I like this. I like crunchy guitars and, and kind of a bit of feedback and stuff like that. I would tend to think that I tried to continue just following my own thing, but being open-minded to listen to the good things.
Well, I wanted to ask you about songwriting as well. Is your songwriting very autobiographical?
Mostly, yeah. I think occasionally I'll write a song that's got absolutely nothing to do with me. I maybe try to write it from another character's point of view or whatever. And then people go, "Oh, I didn't know you thought like that, Douglas." And I go, "No, that wasn't actually meant to be me singing about me. It was me try to find a bit of a different angle." But generally, yeah, very much, I would say my kind of songs are sort of like a heightened version of Douglas and the way that I see the world.
Well, with like serious drugs, an ex-girlfriend said maybe a tablet should be stronger. That's where that line comes from. Do you take influence from everyday life and everyday conversation?
Yeah, definitely. Very much I take it from. And an awful lot of it is like, yeah, falling in love and, hopes and dreams and wishes. I saw Paul McCartney being interviewed the other day, and he was talking about, sometimes when he wrote about love, he wouldn't even be writing about a specific relationship always. Sometimes, like Serious Drugs, it'd be about a very specific incident, a specific relationship. But sometimes it would be the idea of love, the notion of falling in love, and the romance, and the kind of the dream, and the excitement of all that. And Paul was saying that's sometimes what he would be. It wouldn't be just all from this one relationship. It'd be about a kind of bigger feeling of love. And yeah, for me, I would say sometimes it's like that, and then sometimes there's just ones that is such a specific incident. And I think there's a funny thing as well that, Serious Drugs sort of was almost like about, I guess, being dumped, but being dumped in a specific way where I'd been on this medication and dating this medical student in Aberdeen, funnily enough, and them kind of being interested in what my medicine was and go, no, you don't need that. You need my love to make you feel better. Cut to a month later and they're telling me they thought I could do with some stronger tablets. I think an awful lot of ordinary people would just be crushed. Your regular person would be kind of crushed by that. But I was on the train coming back from Aberdeen, kind of almost giggling about the dark humour of that and thinking, I think there's a song here. So, it's like normal people, if there's kind of carnage or danger, whether it's like emotional danger or whatever, you try and remove yourself from a situation. But when you're a songwriter, very often you don't remove yourself from it. You stay in that. You kind of wallow in it and like really, really go in a deep dive and really think about the stuff and, kind of moods and maybe melodies and arrangements. And I'll start to appear in my head. I'll start to hear like a little soundtrack, like I was watching a movie about someone else's life and the characters feeling a bit sad and this kind of plaintive kind of tone comes in, and there's another bit's kind of whimsical and the music changes for that. So when I'm thinking this, I'm starting to almost hear as a replay, probably a slightly heightened version of what had happened to me and what I was hoping might happen next. I would start to hear kind of little ideas for melodies and arrangements.
You mentioned before, like you'd be in your own world sometimes. Do you take inspiration from that as well? Like you can go into there and bring it into the real world.
Yeah, but do you know the thing that's really great about it when you're in that kind of, you're living in that slightly world of fantasy, but you find other mutual dreamers. You know, like for me in the early days, finding Francis McKee, Norman, and Sean, and then going on to find, you know, other people over the years who I could sort of share those kind of adventures and dreams and aspirations with. You know, just dreaming by yourself, I think, can be pretty lonely. But if you've got other people who also maybe don't 100% fit in whatever way and have similar passions, and you can share all that, I always think the best things in life are made to be shared with others. And, you know, I loved making up mixtapes for other people. And I loved turning other people into films. I loved the books I loved and things like that. And I was fortunate I had friends who were sort of similar to that. I remember like the first time Bell and Sebastian went over to America because I'd sort of knew Stewart through Glasgow for years, and then, you know, we're kind of friends in the early days of the band. I got to know the other guys. I made up 8 copies of the same mixtape. And, you know, I didn't have a way of doing tape to tape, so I just went through the same records, recording the same tracks for each member and writing the track list. And Chris, the keyboard player from Bell and Sebastian, who DJs a lot, you know, would tell me, you know, even recently, that when he DJs, there's almost always going to be at least one song from that mixtape back then, and sometimes several. And, you know, there's tracks, you know, the opposite way goes, that, you know, good friends kind of turned me on to. Even guys like Alex Chilton from like Big Star, who became really good friends, you know, with a lot of them Glasgow bands. And I guess Teenage Fan Club were one of the groups that kind of brought Big Star's music back to kind of prominence. He was another guy who loved making mixtapes for people. He loved sharing the music he loved with others. And if he couldn't find the song to put on the mixtape from his record collection, you would get a mixtape for Alex, and it would be all of his, you know, records that he'd put on the tape. And then there'd be a track that he couldn't find the record, so it'd be him doing a cover version of it with his acoustic guitar or whatever, you know, or you know, his electric, and like his girlfriend at the time kind of playing drums in the garage just to kind of turn you on to the song. And, you know, across the oceans, you know, people like Calvin Johnson and Alex would be making mixtapes for us guys, and we'd be making mixtapes for them, and kind of trying to share our enthusiasm and passion for this stuff.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. Like you say, if you've got that like-minded community, then you can do anything, really, can't you?
Yeah, you're stronger together.
Yeah.
You know. Particularly when you're kind of starting out, because we were kind of, you know, kids then, and we were all kind of starting out, and then you start to maybe diversify and go off in your own particular areas. You know, at a point you're maybe in a pretty similar journey and in a similar place. And then some of you end up going on to kind of international fame, or some of you start being a bit more grungy or a bit more dancey or whatever, and you kind of go your own ways. But, you know, I always still have kind of fond memories of, you know, those early days, and, you know, being on the phone to like someone from another band for ages, just, you know, going, and have you heard this record? Have you heard this record? You know, and scribbling down the name, hoping you might find it at the next record fair. You know, back in those days, you really had to hunt for things. I remember there were records that I was looking for in secondhand shops and record fairs for like a decade. And then you'd eventually find it, and your friends would gather around and you'd put it on a record player, and you'd all be like, wow, what is this Lee Hazelwood album going to be like? And you know, and it made it, I think, really, really precious. And now some things are hard to find, but most things you can just like go onto YouTube or go into a streaming network. I mean, there's lots of things in streaming networks that aren't there because they're just not well known or well remembered enough. But most things you can find pretty instantly. And I sort of think that makes it maybe less valued by people, just how important things like how important things like films and music and, to a certain extent, things like books and stuff can be, because, back then they weren't, I remember like before VHS tapes and stuff like that, where you couldn't even, with a film, you might have seen it in the cinema, or you might have seen it in BBC Two one day, and you'd have to maybe wait like a decade, 2 decades before you ever saw it again. You couldn't just go, well, I love that film when it was on, and I've recorded it on a VHS, or you can go out and buy like DVDs for pennies, and now, there's all these streaming services where you can probably find it. Again, music, films, and stuff like that, they weren't just at your fingertips then. You actually actively had to go out, and find stuff, unless you just wanted the mainstream.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your story then about serious drugs, how it came about, because it fascinates me how songs just come out of nowhere. Like, have you got any other stories about any other songs that are interesting like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think, because there's so many songs. I'm just looking, actually. I just happen to have a BMX Bandits record that's been issued on vinyl for the first time tomorrow. And I'm just having a wee look. Yeah, well, in this album, there's a couple of tracks. There's a few cover versions and things in this album. It's a kind of low. It's called Douglas, Stewart, Frankenstein, and it was a kind of album of kind of lo-fi home recordings. And at that time, if you made records at home, it isn't like making records at home now. You can make records at home now, which are kind of spectacular. It was a kind of statement. You were doing something that was a bit more stripped back and things. But anyway, there's two songs in this. There's one called Stupid, and there's one called Airmail. And they were about, I guess, a really painful time where I'd been in a relationship, and the girl I was seeing got pregnant, and we had a baby together, and we got married. And then things started to, well, they'd already started to be quite difficult at times in the relationship. And she decided to leave and go back home. She was from Japan. And I was sort of left with this 2-month-old baby as a kind of single parent. And although I'm saying it was a kind of difficult time, it was emotionally a difficult time. But it was also a really wonderful time, because I was, had this new life, and I was always someone, I liked kids and always wanted to have that as part of my life, having a family and things. So yeah, it was difficult on one level, but and emotionally difficult at times, but also wonderful. And both of those songs were very, very directly about, it was one of those relationships where onlookers and friends were kind of going, man, what is he thinking? Can't you see this relationship's not going to end well? So the song Stupid was sort of about, the people looking on and kind of going, and me going, they must have thought I was stupid, falling in love with you, but they didn't see this and they didn't understand this sort of thing. And that was the kind of idea but for that song. And the other song, Airmail, was, I was not ostracizing this person. I was trying to, still kind of give them updates. And there wasn't email really at that time. So I was like writing them letters to say, oh, the baby's doing fine, and she's doing this, and I was doing this, and how's your new part-time job going? And Yokohama, how's that? And Airmail's sort of like a kind of edited letter to her. It's like an airmail letter to her. It's kind of, how do you feel today? I hope you're feeling all right, and the baby's cold's got better. And I went to the movies with Francis, who, at that time was the other, Francis McDonald was the other main guy in the band. So I was talking about us going to the movies, and, and how the baby was learning to walk now, and soon it should be learning to talk. And then, you kind of end on something that people hopefully don't totally see coming, and it kind of ends with, and and when she smiles, she looks a lot like you do. So there's a kind of poignancy. Because it wasn't like, as I say, this situation was kind of, really sad. And it's just where she was in her life, she couldn't handle being in Scotland in that role and stuff at the time. And so it kind of took that kind of turn. So, and in the case like that, I think it sort of helps. It kind of helps you deal with the situation because you're kind of, you're sort of able to make something positive and something hopefully beautiful out of something that's painful, rather than sometimes when people got things that are hurtful, it makes them angry and resentful and they start like lashing out maybe at someone else or being destructive to themselves. But if you can create a beautiful song and then someone says to you around that time or now, decades later, because this came out originally 30 years ago, it's 30 years on, someone says, "Oh, that song's stupid. Well, that really moved me and I really could relate to it." You go, "Wow, well, that's great."
Yeah.
It's almost like it helped someone else because they connected with it. They maybe had a situation that wasn't even that similar, but in some way they felt a connection. So I think that's always been a really great thing. And for me, I think one of the big things about wanting to make music was wanting to make a connection with other people.
Are you glad it's out on vinyl now then? Tomorrow?
Yeah, at that time, our stuff, the vinyl thing was definitely going in its way down. And so some of our releases were beginning to be, we're just going to bring out in DVD, not DVD, CD. We'll just bring it out in CD. Our early Creation records, the first couple of albums came out in vinyl, cassette, and CD. And then by the time of the third one, it was a bit like very few things were coming out in vinyl. So it was just CD. And then this one was out in a label called Vinyl Japan. And again, they were like, well, everybody in Japan's buying CDs and it's available in Britain, but most people now have moved over to that format. And I mean, I'm not totally tied to formats, but I do. There's just, probably because of my age, there's just something for me romantic about vinyl. I love the sound of a needle going in a record, and you'll always get a wee bit of crackle, at least a wee bit of some sort of organic sound that you don't get from a kind of digital thing. But I sort of love, and I also love the thing of it's like a big sleeve, and you can take it out, and you can read some sleeve notes and look at some other pictures that are inside, and then look at the vinyl itself and read who was involved in making it. I know in digital streaming things, sometimes there might be a little thing in the menu that you can press, and it will be credits, and you look at it and it'll tell you who wrote the songs. But you have to go out your way and clicking a little thing with some dots at the top and going credits, and then just on a computer screen rather soullessly going song by musicians featured or something as dull as that. It doesn't feel exciting. There's not a kind of physical interaction.
Well, you mentioned their Creation. Before you were with Creation, your debut album C86, that was like a really independently released album, wasn't it? Like, what was that like? About yourself?
I released it myself. I ended up being reissued, a few times over the years by other people. But the initial vinyl, and that was just vinyl, was myself. And unfortunately, my timing wasn't good because the distribution wing or the distribution organisation at that time was Rough Trade. Before, now it's like a label and kind of shops and stuff like that. But at that time, Rough Trade were also, as well as a label, the big distributors. And Rough Trade's kind of distribution thing went bust. And suddenly, it's like I would have maybe 300 or whatever copies left on vinyl of these records. And you were locked in a kind of a cupboard somewhere because they were all part of the process I had to be going through of, this company's went bankrupt. So everything in their offices and our warehouse is sort of sealed and held, and you're not getting paid for anything. You know, so I was just a kid who didn't really have any money because we were in a band that weren't selling loads and loads of records. So, you know, I didn't really have any kind of spare cash particularly. And it was like, of the cash you spent, you're not getting that back. And you're not getting back any of the profits because, and you might not even get your stock back. Eventually, I was lucky. Someone tipped me off to a point where if you get someone who lives quite close to here to come by in a car, there's a wee window where a store's going to be open and we'll hand them some boxes of the rest of your stock. But, you know, for a lot of people, for like big labels like Creation, who weren't as big as they went on to be, but, you know, at that time, a bigger thing, they were losing ridiculous amounts of money, you know, possibly hundreds of thousands. For me, I was losing maybe £10,000, but £10,000 when, you know, you're sort of a young kid who doesn't really have a regular income and stuff, and you just like spent most of the money you had bringing out this thing, isn't going to, and it's not really going to help it get to the audience that you wanted it to get to. And you're going to have a kind of extra burden on your shoulders of, oh my God, how am I going to actually pay for this, and this? Because I was thinking I was going to have a wee bit of money coming in here, and I don't.
What is your favourite BMX Bandits album?
My favourite BMX Bandits album is an album called My Chain, which is 20 years ago. It's like that one's from 30 years ago, and this the first single was 40 years ago, and My Chain's 20 years ago. And that's another example of what we were talking about, incredibly personal. A sort of, in reflection, I think a lot of people would say, again, I kind of made a bit of a mistake, perhaps falling in love with the wrong person and being really committed to the idea of this new love. And it didn't really turn out good. And My Chain was kind of interesting because it was sort of written and recorded in sort of real time. So it'd be like, this is happening in a relationship. And so I've written and went over to the studio and sat with David Scott and worked on this, you know, track that's just reporting how I'm feeling right now. Oh, now this other thing's happened. And so I'm now, you know, the day after I'm in the studio reporting on and that sort of thing in the song. And then the next day, and usually very often, it used to be if you made a record, you have all these tracks. And then you'd go, right, well, what order will I put them in? And My Chain, it was like a chain of songs. Like, and sometimes even the next song might refer to the song that you've just heard. You know, it'd be a reaction to what you've just heard and what's happened since. So the order of the songs was never, there's never any debate about it because that was the order. Because it was like a sort of almost like a diary of the relationship. And there's a couple of cover versions on it. And the reason there was a couple of cover versions on it was there was points in the relationship. And I think we maybe spoke a wee bit about this, where I heard someone else's song and that seemed to speak to me so much about what I was going through that it felt like I should put that in as part of this story because, and, you know, change the version of it. I was working in the BBC. I used to work in BBC television on kind of music shows, but also things like kids shows and entertainment shows and stuff like that. And I was working on a kind of the big national BBC Saturday morning show. And there was this song, this granny. They had this feature where it was like kind of grannies or aunties and things, their mums and dads would come on and do a kind of embarrassing karaoke. It was meant to be embarrassing to the kids. And so this kid in the audience, his granny, came on and sang, as a surprise to him, Hopelessly Devoted to You, you know, from Greece. And, you know, the whole thing was everybody was like, oh man, it's so embarrassing. But I was listening to it going, that's exactly how I feel. You know, so suddenly I was like, I kind of saw almost like like myself in this kind of movie scene where I was like, you know, Sandy, you know, sitting at the wishing well, yearning for this kind of love that I was missing. And I was like, well, that song says something that I feel is so perfectly captured. And also it's kind of interesting because probably people would go, I didn't see them doing a cover version of a song from Greece. Not that the songs in Greece are brilliant, and there's sort of no reason that you should be embarrassed by it, but it wouldn't be a typical thing for, I suppose, kind of indie pop guitar band from Glasgow to be necessarily recording. And there was another one which was a Daft Punk cover, and the amount of people who have said to me, and it's kind of funny because obviously Daft Punk are a much larger kind of band than BMX Bandits. They're going, I always thought that was your song, this song, Something About Us. But I was in a clothes shop the other day, and we were playing this, what I thought was a cover version of it. And then, we Shazammed it and went, oh, Daft Punk. I didn't know Daft Punk did a cover version of a BMX Bandits song. You're going, we didn't. But again, when people listen to it, it made me feel, well, I made the right choice because people bought into the fact of you. Oh, that doesn't sound like he's just covering someone else's words and music. That sounds like it's an expression of how he's kind of feeling.
Your debut single came out 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Got pretty slated in the press at the time. What was the
man, yeah.
Did you have a bad relationship with the press throughout, or what's it been like?
The music press in the early days, really, it's funny because Sean and Jim McCulloch were in BMX Bandits and were in Soup Dragons. And we loved Soup Dragons so much, and he hated BMX Bandits so much. That doesn't mean every writer did. There was writers who were really, really loved BMX Bandits and would come to me and say, listen, Douglas, I really want to write about BMX Bandits, but the editor won't allow us to write about them, or will only want bad reviews. They have a thing of, the music papers would almost have it. It was like a political party. They would have this notion of going, we are against this, and this, and we are for this, and this. And BMX Bandits were one of the bands that we disliked. And it was, I can't remember how many, it was maybe a month or a few weeks before the NME reviewed the Soup Dragons' first release, and it was a flexi disc. And they reviewed it and said, this is the greatest single ever made. Cut to a roundabout, something like a month later, and the review actually, word for word, pretty much says this could be the worst record ever made.
Yeah.
And it goes on to be even more insulting. But I genuinely, I think both Norman and Sean might have even said this in interviews and film that are out there, that people who thought I was going to, because people were going, oh, the big man must be a bit upset about that, or a bit, sad, he dreamed about having a record out and then that's what he gets. They were like, oh, you obviously don't know Douglas. I was just walking about with a copy of the Enemy under my arm. Anyone I could bump into, whether it was someone I vaguely knew, it was someone's auntie in Belshill, or whether it was someone who was a kind of friend, I'd be opening them going, have you seen this review? The worst record ever made. Ever. And when it got played on Roundtable, which was, I'm not sure if that still exists, Radio 1 had this Friday night record review show where they would always have a couple of people from other bands, and it would be hosted by different people through the years. And Janice Long was the host at that point. The lovely late Janice Long, who was one of their big supporters. She played E102, and people on it reviewing it, well, again, were so appalled. There was something like about a 20-minute argument between Janice and the other guests on the show. And he used to have a kind of best of Radio 1 show where the whole argument was repeated on their Sunday best of Radio 1 thing, because people were so like, I mean, this record is... And I've met quite a lot of people who have actually said to me, at the time when I heard that single, I hated it so much, and now I listen to it and go, that's really great. But at the time, it wasn't. And I think Serious Drugs was sort of like that. At the time, although people actually did the opposite, they really embraced it. It wasn't going in the direction that things were going. And Serious Drugs was actually not released to something like 1993, but it was recorded in 1991. And if you think of the context of 1991, it was noisy guitars, vocals quite often quite far back in the mix. It wasn't kind of sweet, very polished vocals that were high in the mix with kind of lush harmonies and all that sort of thing. That thing really took off a couple of years later. But yeah, when we did Serious Drugs, it wasn't the direction things were going, and I don't do it for the sake of doing it, but I quite like, when I get the idea for something, in a track that feels like it's not going necessarily the same way as everybody else. Because it's like, if everybody else is doing it, do you also need me to do it? It's like cans of beans, There's already Heinz, Asda, whoever own brand, Branston beans out there. How many more companies do you need making baked beans? How many more people do you make? Do you want making kind of grunge-tastic records that all sound sort of as if they're going in the same direction? Maybe what you want in that kind of sea is something that's completely different. Something that's very sweet and melodious and not messy at all and kind of sincere and kind of vulnerable. And I think that, I think it's a bit of a shame, Serious Drugs, just because of we were committed to another label at a point. We had to wait until it was released, and in 2 years, things can be big changes. But I think if it came out in 1991 when it had been recorded, it might have even had a kind of bigger impact.
You feel as well, with your look as well with it, it came out like an anti-drug week as well, did it?
Yeah, I mean, now you see that makes me laugh. But at the time, yeah, there was a record at the same time, which was, the chorus, slightly disguised, were going, "Ease are good, Ebenezer good," basically saying, these are really good drugs. Get these and get off your head. We had a record which was about medication. It wasn't about recreational drugs. It wasn't about, telling people to go out and get wasted and take, dangerous drugs or whatever. That wasn't what it was about. But the hook line for our song was, "Get some serious drugs." And it was going to be a record of the week for one of the Radio 1 DJs. And it had been, I think, A-listed and stuff like that. And then we got the call to the person who did the radio plugin at Creation. And they're like, Radio 1 aren't going to be able to play it anymore because, well, they hadn't started playing it yet, but it was planned because it's going to be their anti-drugs week. And, how can we have, and I get it actually, how can you be having your big anti-drugs week where there's going to be stings through all the shows and all that sort of stuff? And then you put on a record that's good, "Get some serious drugs, get some serious," because a lot of other people aren't going to necessarily listen to the lyrics in the verse and kind of go, "Oh, I don't really think that's about taking ecstasy or whatever like that. I think that's got something else going on in it." No, they're just going to hear, "Get some serious drugs. Hey kids, go out and get them." And it's funny because, I haven't, I don't drink, and I've not had an alcoholic drink since I was 17, and I don't do recreational drugs. I just never had any interest in them. So it's again, a bit of an irony that the guy who had a record band by Radio 1 called Serious Drugs was just never into that world. That just wasn't my thing.
Well, you mentioned Creation there, obviously. It's been quite a big Scottish record label with Primal Scream on it yourselves.
And lots of drugs.
Oasis eventually on it. What was it like being on that label? Did you enjoy it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll always be incredibly grateful to Alan. Alan kind of signed us on the back of Hearing Serious Drugs. And Alan was one of those guys who knew loads of people I knew, and I knew loads of people that knew him. And he'd an idea in BMX Bandits without really hearing them. And I think we've all have these things, whether it's films or music or whatever, we get the idea before it actually hearing the thing or seeing the thing. Nah, it's not for me. I wouldn't like that. And sometimes you almost feel quite strongly about it. Nah, even though you haven't really heard the thing. And Alan had really decided he really didn't like BMX Bandits, but he hadn't actually heard this. And that's fair enough, because I think we all do it. He had a notion we were a sort of comedy band or something, just from things he'd heard and seen. And although he'd never heard our music. And then when he heard Serious Drugs, and I think that says a lot for him, he was like, man, I was wrong. And then he heard other things and he came to see us live. He's going, you guys have got like really good songs and you're not a joke band. You know, Douglas will sometimes be kind of funny and it'll be a little bit maybe humour in some of the lyrics, but it's not like a joke band at all. I'm going to have this mission to change other people's preconceived notions about this band. You know, kind of turn their heads and make them actually listen to BMX Bandits. And I think he really thought, there was a point where he thought we were going to be the next big band in creation. And, you know, looking back, he sort of said, you know, this was before, I guess, Pulp and Jarvis kind of hit the mainstream and they were going for years. He's going, in his head, he sort of saw me as being a figure like Jarvis became. But Jarvis became that guy. You know, but he saw me as the sort of guy who would, you know, be on kind of mainstream telly things and kind of cross over in that sort of way and, you know, be invited on to kind of panel shows and all these sort of things. But as I say, yeah, that ended up happening with Jarvis and not happening with BMX Bandits. And that's fine because, to be honest, I think Jarvis probably actually did suit that more because he's, you know, he's very, very eloquent and stuff like that. And he'd also done his time, you know, he'd been around even longer than I had before people really started to pay attention to his music. So fair play to him. But yeah, Alan, you know, was so supportive, and he would call people into the office and play a new BMX Bandits and try and say, I think this is brilliant and I want everyone working really, really hard to get this heard by as many people and written about by as many people as possible. You know, and everybody would be standing there, everybody working in the company, getting played by Alan and hearing his kind of passion, because he was a passion guy. And but when Oasis happened, Alan had become ill. He was a wee bit in the back burner. Oasis joined. They were bringing so much money into the label and stuff like that. And I think sometimes naively you think, well, that will be good for everybody in the label. But it's not, because suddenly Sony, who have become very involved, and other people are going, why would we be spending effort on records by people like Momus and BMX Bandits and 18-wheeler when we could be concentrating on this thing, which is huge, and selling even more millions of records of that than selling, you know, a few thousand records by this other kind of more minority taste thing. And I think that was sort of the beginning of the end for Alan. We made one, not for Alan, for Creation. And Alan and I, one day, we just had a phone call. I can't even remember if it was him that called me, because we were friends. We cared about each other and respected each other. And we had a wee discussion and went, it's probably now time probably for BMX Bandits to move on from Creation, because we weren't getting a lot of attention paid to us anymore. And Alan wasn't really as involved in the label anymore, in the day-to-day running of it, and his own individual passions, you know, that weren't as popular as Oasis. I mean, they were a passion for Alan as well, of course, but, you know, they had a lot of money and a lot of effort getting spent on them. And so the more minority things, the odder things that were coming out in Creation were sort of swept aside, and BMX Bandits were part of that. But yeah, I'll always be grateful to Alan, because the records from those years, including Serious Drugs, have been a big part of what's maintained people's interest, the new generation of people discovering their music, you know.
Do you think it's ironic again that Oasis first tour was supporting BMX Bandits?
Yeah, it is. It's kind of funny. But again, there's an irony there, because we were one of the bands that they were giving tour support out to, and we were kind of playing, not like big venues, but, you know, kind of student union, reasonable size kind of venues across the country. And Alan wanted them, before any of the records were released, to go out and do some dates with one of the Creation bands. And Alan said to me, like, I sort of said to a bunch of the other kind of bands in Creation, and none of them are into taking taking the boys out. Would you take them out, and give them some dates? And I was like, well, I don't need to even hear them. You've done so much for us, Alan.
Yeah.
How could I say no? You've kind of when people had totally written off BMX Bandits, the majority of people had written off BMX Bandits, you kind of signed us up and were telling people, no, this is a really serious band that should be getting a lot of attention. Would I take them out for you? Of course. And so yeah, we did. We didn't do the whole tour, but we done a bunch of dates in this quite extensive tour we did in the UK. And I think pretty much all of us that were in the band at that time, watching them playing in front of 40 people in various student unions, because it was that sort of thing, as they were on first, then 18-wheeler were on, and then we were on.
Mm.
And like, not many people came in for the support band necessarily, but the support band, even less people came in. So there'd be like some people that would still be downstairs just playing snooker because they go, yeah, I'll go up and see the main band, or I'll go up and see a bit of the band before, but I'm not going to go up and see whoever's on first. Why would I do that? And I'm sure there's lots of people who were there on certain nights who'll now go, oh yeah, I was at that gig. But they were probably downstairs, as I say, playing some sort of machines or playing snooker or just hanging about, just kind of pissing about downstairs. So sometimes they would go on stage and it would be like 40 or 50 people would be watching their set. But I think all of us, and it wasn't based on whether we thought they were great or they were totally our thing or whatever, could see there was something there that I mean, X Factor had different kind of meaning back then, but that X Factor, and for me, a big part of that was like Liam's on stage charisma.
Mm.
He just had that. He just had that thing of he was playing in front of a small audience, but if you kind of drifted off into a wee kind of fantasy world, as I often did, you could flip from that world that was the reality of now to him being on this massive, massive stage in a stadium, and it was totally believable. Even at that early stage, you could just go, well, I think that could happen for them. And there's lots of bands that at that stage you wouldn't have seen it. Even later on, you maybe would see it. But it was like instantly, as I say, particularly for me, the thing with Liam, I could just see him as being this guy holding a massive crowd in the palm of his hands, and them just playing to really big crowds, and I told Alan that, but he'd already seen that, when he saw them playing something like fourth in the bill at a gig in King Tut's, he wasn't even meant to be playing.
Yeah.
He had that thing that he went, man, this could be massive. He just felt that way.
Well, with like yourself, have you got a favourite show that you've ever played or that sticks out?
There's so many, and there's also other shows that have become like they blurred into being the same show. Things like maybe a tour of Japan that I'll have all these memories from, which is like from maybe 35 years ago or whatever. And it's like sometimes I'm like, is that memory also from that show in Tokyo? Is that one from a show in Hiroshima or Yokohama? They kind of blurred a wee bit into each other in the same way, shows in Britain and things. It's like, yeah, that happened on that tour, but did that actually happen? But there are ones that'll always kind of stand out. And one of the big ones for me, which is actually, I think it was like a year ago in maybe 3 days, BMX Bandits hadn't played in our hometown of Belshill for probably since the 1980s. We went back and played, and back in the 80s in Belshill, people were getting really interested in all these bands elsewhere. But in Belshill, people weren't interested. They were a bit like, who did they think? Yeah. And we went back and played, and it was amazing. The audience were so warm and lovely. And it did feel a bit like I've kind of come home and people are going, yeah, well, you've done really well. That's great. And it wasn't like, I was probably, 200 and 250 people. It was a reasonably small venue, but people were really, really loving it. And there was like young kids who, you know, I was speaking to after the show, who were kind of going, "Oh, I've just started my band, and we really love BMX Bandits, and we love Teenage Fan Club, and we love the Vaselines and the Soup Dragons and the Pastels," and I was going, "It's great. These guys are like 20 or 19 or something like that, and they're excited by things we done, and you know, they're coming to see us." And we played with a band called the Chords, who are like two teenage sisters from kind of Ayrshire. I now live in Ayrshire as well. They were the opening act, and again, they're really excited by that kind of generation of bands that we were part of, bands like Shop Assistants and stuff like that. And so they opened for us, and again, it felt kind of a really lovely thing, because you know, it's like I'm kind of thinking to myself, like, when I'm going, there's going to be the young guys, and there's going to be like the Chords, these like two young girls continuing on this thing. You know, this thing will still be alive, because that's what it's about. It's about kind of making a connection and passing something on. You know, and you'll probably be the same thing. You'll watch films or you'll listen to records, and you'll suddenly go, "Man, almost everybody involved in that's now gone, or you know, or has disappeared, not making music anymore. But that record still feels as magical and as important and as vibrant as it ever felt, you know." So that one was a real standout. I mean, there's things like, you know, we played a Creation. We played, I think it was the 10 years of Creation celebration at the Royal Albert Hall. And you go, well, that's amazing. BMX Bandits playing in a bill with all these other people at the Royal Albert Hall. But in a funny way, that more personal thing of that little gig in Belshill a year ago maybe feels even more special. You know, and I met probably the main loves of my life through being in the band and stuff like that. So I wouldn't have the kids that I had, and I wouldn't have, you know, a lot of other really magical, important things happening in my life if I hadn't been in the band, because I wouldn't have got to go and play in Japan or got to go play here or whatever. No, I wouldn't have been in that place if I hadn't done that thing of going, I'm not going to listen to the people mocking me and laughing. Okay, I'm not earning lots of money, but I'm just going to keep doing it anyway. So kind of some sort of bloody mindedness is a helpful thing if you're going to be a musician or artist.
Yeah, because I was going to say, like, it's 41 years since the band started. Is it true you don't think you get past one gig, never mind 41 years?
Well, the reaction from the audience, gig number one, made me sort of think, you know, are they ever going to ask us to do this again? Is Andy ever going to ask us to make a record? But somebody did, you know, Stephen Pastel asked us to make a record. Stephen and David Keegan from Shop Assistants asked us to bring out our first single. Then somebody else asked us to make a record. Then it felt like no one was interested in the band for a while. And then Al McGee asked us to make a record. And then, so we've always just been really, really lucky. And now records, you know, that this got very little attention at the time. It kind of fell down some sort of, you know, dark hole just as we'd left Creation. People are rediscovering, you know, the records that maybe sold less and got less attention. So it's kind of, you know, it's great.
Yeah, brilliant. You deserve it, though, 'cause it is great music. And are you working on new music at the moment?
Yeah, I think it was last week. My friend Rory, who I'm working with just now in BMX Bandits, and I went out to Norman Blake's house, and by the end of the day, we had most of probably the first track to be recorded for the next album down in tape. Like just the three of us. Quite often I quite like working with just two people in a studio or three at a time. I mean, there'll be some tracks that'll be more kind of, you know, going in maybe with a kind of fuller band or whatever. But I quite like that intimate thing and the excitement that you can get going between just two or three people collaborating.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And you've got some live shows coming up as well, haven't you?
Yeah, well, there's a screening of a film called Teenage Superstars, which is about all of the kind of bands I guess we've been talking about. I mean, Oasis aren't in it. But Primal Scream, Mary Chain, Bandits, Soup Dragons, Vaselines, etc. are all in this film, Teenage Superstars. And that's getting shown in Belshill, in the same place where we played that little gig a year ago. And Sean, Norman and I are doing a Q&A there. And that's going to be the first time I think all three of us will have been back in Belshill at the same time for like, I would think maybe something like 35 years. So that's going to be kind of a really kind of special thing because, you know, we still all love each other. We don't see as much as we'd like to just because, you know, geography and other things in life. But just that's where it started for us. And we're going on for that. And then on Saturday, as a duo, we're opening for a band called the Bevis Front, who are just one of the bands that lots of musicians and songwriters are big fans of, but he never really had a big hit or anything like that. But, you know, we like to do the kind of gigs where you get the chance to, you know, meet somebody that you have admired and thought are great songwriters and play with them, even though it's not really your show. And then we've got like, a couple of gigs in the kind of north of England, and then we're playing on the Golden Hind, you know, famous historical boat, the only venue to have circumnavigated the world, I would imagine. This old sailing ship down in London. We're playing again a stripped down show in there the end of June, and then we've got a kind of a festival called Replay, which is happening in Perthshire in Scotland. We've not got as many gigs this year because there's been a bit of, like, as always happens, lineup change kind of stuff going on with BMX Bandits, and I want to kind of concentrate on trying to get this new record made and stuff. But we're always doing something.
Yeah, good, yeah. Well, thank you for joining me, Douglas. It's been great to speak to you.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Yeah, you too.
Brilliant, cool. Well, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for listening and for your interest and your questions. Thanks very much.
No, I'm a big fan of your music, so it's been great to hear the stories behind it all, and I have really enjoyed speaking to you and getting to know you, so thank you for
Cool. Brilliant. Well, I've just had my little 3-year-old daughter coming through the door, so the timing's good. So I'll say bye and hopefully meet you in person sometime.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, yeah.
Okay.
See you in a minute.
Bye.
Bye
Bye now.